Out of Ireland have we come. Great hatred, little room maimed us at the start. I carry from my mother's womb a fanatic heart. On the morning of Easter Monday 1916, where was W.B. Yeats, the great poet and Irish nationalist? His vision of Ireland was peaceful, pluralist, democratic, but now Dublin was in the throes of an armed uprising. Oh, that's great. It's a beautiful drawing. I've never seen it even reproduced. But what's really interesting about this, where this sort of, touches history, is that this is exactly Yeats at the moment that the guns were firing in O'Connell Street on Easter Monday in 1916. This is what he was doing. He was being sketched by his friend, the artist William Rothenstein, in his house in Gloucestershire where he was staying. Of course, this is before he knows that at this moment that this has been drawn, that people are being killed and being shot and being fired at. But the shock of Easter week has a profound effect on him and of course on the country, but more specifically his art.
Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold.
But I am old, and you are young.
I carry from my mother's womb a fanatic heart.
There is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms.
Changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
The Easter Rising lasted 6 days and left nearly 500 dead. When the leaders were captured and executed, the ensuing outrage led to more carnage and more death, and ultimately, many think, to Irish independence. But I believe the glorification of what happened that week in the GPO stained my country's history in blood for decades. When I was 14, the Ireland I loved was in the poems of W.B. Yeats and others, and the Ireland I detested was celebrating the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising with bad North Korea-type military displays and emotionally overblown TV coverage elevating the delirium and intoxication of the blood sacrifice into some awful national mythology. I find myself very conflicted by the idea of the blood sacrifice and heroism, the delirium of death. Dying is very easy. I've been around it a lot. It isn't radical to die, it's inevitable. Staying alive is hard. Life is hard. Staying alive to change and implement change must be what it's about. Dying for a cause? Whose cause? The individuals? Hoping that something will come out of it. This ludicrous notion of death or glory, or death and glory, escapes me. W.B. Yeats didn't die for Ireland. He stayed alive to fight for Ireland, a better, inclusive, progressive version of Ireland, and to fight against the version I eventually fled, petty, censorious Catholic narrow-mindedness, fixated with the false glory of martyrdom. Had they converted into a project of self-sacrifice?
Well, there I think we come back to the Catholicization of the thing in retrospect, and to Pearse's writings, very cleverly aimed at exactly this interpretation of it, which were written just before the Rising and released just after it, where the whole thing is inscribed into the tradition of Catholic sacrifice and of mysticism and of the way of the cross and of Calvary and all the rest of it. The other thing is that the calculation is, and this does seem to be the case, this isn't retrospective, that they knew they would be executed and that this would bring about a response in public opinion in Ireland, and there they were absolutely right.
Fine. Meanwhile, at the end of all this, you get 500 people dead. I mean, how dare they?
You may say, how dare they, but for them, the 500 people dead were worth the reward, which was a revived radical Republican
And Stalin would have exactly the same point.
Perhaps.
So the people of 1916 are an elite, a revolutionary elite blinded by, blood-dimmed revolutionary lust.
You say that, I didn't say it.
I am saying it.
They're certainly a revolutionary elite, and they're certainly
So
bent
he would have approved of that.
They're bent on the vertigo of self-sacrifice. And that's how Yeats will both commemorate them and remember them.
Oh, but we talked at large before the 16 men were shot. But who can talk of give and take, what should be and what not, while those dead men are loitering there to stir the boiling pot? You say that we should still the land till Germany's overcome. But who is there to argue that, now Pierce is deaf and dumb? And is there logic to outweigh MacDonagh's bony thumb? How could you dream they'd listen, that have an ear alone for those new comrades they have found, Lord Edward and Wolfe Tone, or meddle with our give and take that converse bone to bone?
Hero tales and legends of the Serbians. This is Yeats's library that his wife gave to the National Library. These are the books. This is what surrounded him all his life. Here we go. George Moore's. Well, Shelley and Blake, yeah, they're his two touchstones, aren't they? Look at this, Folklore in the Old Testament. That's a really interesting book. The Wasteland, for William Butler Yeats, Esquire, in admiration of his work, T.S. Eliot. These are his own editions of his own work, so I have to wear the gloves that made famous on endless history programs. And these are, from Ireland's point of view, almost sacred texts. And why not?
I have met them at the close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among grey 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where motley is worn. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
The events of 1916 took him aback, and he didn't quite know how to respond to it. Then, of course, like everybody else, he recoiled at what the authorities did to the leaders, which was a serious political mistake, of course, and just went with the cack-handedness and misgovernment of what was coming from London. He sat down and put his own doubt and shock and questioning into one of the most powerful poems of the century in any language.
Was it needless death, after all? For England may keep faith for all that is done and said. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead.
And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonagh and MacBride and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn or changed utterly. a terrible beauty is born. Brilliant.
One person wasn't so sure that Yeats got it right. His inspirational muse and great love of his life, Maud, gone. And now, because of the Rising, this fanatic Republican icon was a widow.
Maud is outraged by this Easter 1916. She thinks he's betrayed the actual Rising itself.
No, Willie, I do not like your poem, begins this terrific letter. I think it's one of the great political poems because of its ambivalence, but it does reflect the upheavals of his own life during that summer with Maud, with her daughter Isolde, and I think the stanza about the stone of fanaticism in the stream of life is very much about
his
his
obsession with one idea that blocks any other.
Maud is the unspoken presence in that poem. It's probably his last great love poem to her. But I think the main thing is the man is in the throes of what can only be called a nervous breakdown. He is at the absolute edge of self-control. It's the fallout of 1916 into 1917. His horoscopes have told him all sorts of world-shattering things are happening. He's looking for certainty everywhere, as he has done in the strangest places over the last few years.
The 18 months after the Rising saw WB descend into spirals of confusion and depression about politics, but also about his own personal life. He's a 52-year-old bachelor, and as many horoscopes, seances and visits to mediums insist he must be married by the end of the year. In this state of panic, Willie heads to Normandy to visit Maud and her travelling menagerie of parrots, monkeys, dogs and cats. He proposes one last time and she turns him down again. Then, literally, he turns and walks along the beach to her 22-year-old daughter Isolde and proposes to her. After all, she'd flirtingly proposed to him just 2 years earlier.
Oh, you will take whatever's offered and dream that all the world's a friend. Suffer as your mother suffered. Be as broken in the end. But I am old, and you are young, and I speak a barbarous tongue.
Isolde says no. In this emotional meltdown, Willie thinks, well, who else do I know? So the now hysterical Yeats heads straight back to England and proposes to Georgie Hyde-Lees, the daughter of a friend, who says, OK. Within days, under pressure of the horoscope deadline, the happy couple arrive at a London register office.
But Lily, Willie's sister, took to her immediately. She is not good looking, but is comely. Her nose is too big for good looks, her colour ruddy and her hair reddish brown. Her eyes are very good and a fine blue with very dark, strongly marked eyebrows. She is quiet, but not slow. Her brain, I would judge, quick and trained and sensitive. In fact, everyone remarked on the intelligence of the woman.
Yeats, although now married and on his honeymoon, was still in a complete state of panic. Had he let down Maud or Isolde? Was he betraying his new wife by not being fully committed to her? That's when Georgie displayed her true talents.
So he'd met his deadline. He had got married by that astrological deadline. Hurrah, he'd found somebody, less than half his age who was willing to marry him. That's a great success.
Yeah.
That's not a failure, that's a success. So they get married, they go on honeymoon, they go down to this little hotel in just south of London, and first night, nothing happens sexually. Second night, nothing happens sexually. Third night, it's really disconcerting for her. It's really stressful. And they, between them, decide to start doing some automatic writing. And she starts doing this automatic writing.
Wasn't that bonkers, actually?
No, it wasn't that bonkers.
To go along with it. Well, you would say that because you're
I would say that, wouldn't I?
selling bonkers books in this bookshop, with this hippie sofa and stuff,
She comes from an occultist background. He comes from an occultist background. It's a thing that she knows about. It's a thing that he knows about. It's a thing that he's very keen that she does. And she sits down to do it, and she starts. And they get some results. He loves it. He absolutely loves it.
It transpires Georgie had the ability to connect the pen in her hand to the great wisdom of some unknown spiritual instructors. Willie would ask a question and Georgie's pen would automatically write out an answer. For Willie, this was the pinnacle of a lifetime of spiritual quest, new ideas, new metaphors for his poetry. Roy Foster called it a factory for mysterious images, and Willie didn't want it to stop.
They go on day after day, and what we start seeing in her writing, the channel needs more love and attention. The instrument in the channel will have more success if she receives more love and attention and rest, and love and attention and rest. And I do believe that at a certain point, Yeats was like, oh my gosh, look, it's saying that you need more love and attention. And it's very clear that through her automatic writing, she is saying that she will do more, longer, better automatic writing if she gets a good seeing too.
But isn't that always what all of this was about? From the fairy legends to the folk legends, to the Rosicrucianism, to the Theosophy, just this constant search for stimulation of new imagery.
You know this yourself. That's what creative writers, that's what poets, that's what songwriters do. They're ruthless in the search of a theme. Ruthless. And they will rummage through anything and extract anything and steal anything in order to get an inspirational image out of which will come a poem or a song or a piece of creative writing.
What they undertook to do, they brought to pass. All things hang like a drop of dew upon a blade of grass. So simple.
Yeats's new domestic stability sat uneasily with the end of the Great War and the rise of Bolshevism. At home, England's hesitation in implementing hard-fought for Home Rule provoked the Irish War of Independence. It was only 1919, but with that remarkable prescience of his, he could sense impending doom. And with his store of magical metaphors and imagery, a new, sharper and darker genius began to emerge.
Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming? Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born?
Creatively and emotionally, W.B. Yeats had found a new maturity. He gave up his old London bachelor pad and tried to create a family home in his mythical dreamtime, the west of Ireland.
And he thought he needed a place back here near Cool Park, near Lady Gregory's place. And he'd seen this tower here in the late 1890s. It suited his image of himself as the poet solitary, vigilant. It's pretty ludicrous that we're sort of sculling along past this place, because of course it isn't normally like this. This is a road and the river's down there, and we're now crossing over normally a bridge. But the countryside is in flood. But the problem with the tower was that it was regularly in flood. And it was with some dismay that he brought Georgie back here, his wife, and raised his kids a lot of the time. He thought it was freezing and, no electricity or anything. But he loved it, and you can see why. It's got that austere beauty that's so prevalent in the poetry. Pound said this is Willie's phallic symbol in the country, Ballyphallus, or whatever it is he calls it, with the river flowing through the first floor. And there it is. What a place to live in.
Although I can see him still, the freckled man who goes to a grey place on a hill in grey Connemara clothes at dawn to cast his flies. It's long since I began to call up to the eyes this wise and simple man. All day I'd looked in the face what I'd hoped would be to write for my own race and the reality.
Ireland was now in the middle of a vicious and cruel war of independence, and Yeats was rightly outraged by the atrocities committed around Coole and Ballylee by the warring parties. He finally publishes his Easter Rebellion poetry and nails his nationalism to the mast. In 1921, in a speech to the Oxford Union, he launched a blazing attack on the English in Ireland. "I am a Victorian," he said. "They knew the meaning of the terms truth, honour and justice, but you do not know the meaning of them." W.B. Yeats is no longer ambivalent. Once again, he wants to stand up and be counted.
He was a one-man anti-immigration scheme. He didn't want to leave like Joyce and Beckett and Wilde and Shaw. He didn't want to go. He wanted to stay and change. And it's kind of the boring point I've been making about this whole film. You can die for a cause, but you can live for a reason. It's only being alive that change happens. And that was the route he took.
The Anglo-Irish Treaty brought about a compromise which Yeats supported, the Irish Free State. He accepted a role as senator in this new government. This was no token position. Ireland was now in a civil war. Senators were being attacked, houses were being burned. His own new home on Merrion Square in Dublin was shot at and had armed guards.
He was going in to the Senate to ensure that the revolution that he had helped to engender and the unique literary revolution that he hoped would become the soul of the country, which in fact it did, should endure and should be ensured.
The new conservative Catholic Free State was packing women back into the kitchen and sidelining important and vocal Protestants into the Senate. The plurality which the rebellion had promised had been replaced with what, in effect, was a Catholic clerical coup d'etat. Unbelievably, a later government even sent a telegram to the Pope desiring to repose at the feet of your holiness on our devotion to your august person. But nobody would muzzle W.B. Yeats. He stood up against legislation that he saw not only as unjust, but that might alienate Protestants and rule out any chance of a united Ireland. He wrote, "We must become a modern, tolerant, liberal nation." He argued unsuccessfully against the compulsory use of Irish language, against censorship and the Catholic fear of evil literature, like James Joyce's Ulysses.
Some people see him still, though, as the Englishman, don't they? I mean, they're sort of dismissive of him.
Well, yeah, I think he's seen as somebody who's speaking for values that are alien to what the increasingly pietistic Catholic, pledging allegiance to the Pope, Free State governments want. He believes that the artistic imagination is part of the way a country empowers and liberates itself. And that's what he's preaching in the Senate as well. He talks on issues of art, on issues of education, on issues of culture. That's what he thinks an upper house in a modern government should be. And that's what he thinks is being denigrated by the new highly Catholic, very bourgeois, very conservative polity that the Free State's become.
Famously, Yeats spoke out in vain against the new state's plan to prohibit divorce. He felt that it was grossly oppressive to the Protestant minority, and he said, "I am proud to consider myself a typical man of that minority. We against whom you have done this thing are no petty people." and he rightly claimed that when the iceberg of Catholic control melted, Ireland would become an increasingly tolerant country.
I walk through the long schoolroom questioning. A kind old nun in a white hood replies. The children learn to cipher and to sing, to study reading books and history, to cut and sew, be neat in everything, in the best modern way. The children's eyes in momentary wonder stare upon a 60-year-old smiling public man.
This film could actually be called How the Prods Invented Catholic Ireland. You know, so many of the great heroes of this story, going way back, the great revolutionaries, Emmet, Wolfe Tone, never mind the literary figures, Douglas Hyde, so critical to the realisation of national self, coming to sort of an apotheosis in Yeats's genius, were of course Protestants. And Yeats wasn't going to let that pass. He was deeply proud of his caste and his background and his people and their rallying call of nationalism.
At every turn, Yeats constantly had to fight against the narrow-minded worldview of this new young Ireland. He chaired the coinage committee but was attacked for choosing pagan designs by an English Protestant. Maud Gonne in particular hated them. Less successfully, perhaps, he also advised on the design for the new robes for the Irish judiciary.
Unfortunately, this is what he thought Irish judges should wear, sitting in front of sort of gougers and yahoos and corner boys, you know, drug dealing and beating up people when the pubs came out. They would stand in the dock in front of people dressed as this. Are you serious? Go, Jays, what do you got on there, Your Honour, you know? And of course, every lawyer who saw this think they were going to be judges in the new independent country. We're looking at this, you can fuck off if you think I'm ever going to wear that.
Regardless of what some in Ireland thought of W.B. Yeats's Irishness, in 1923, Europe and the world were about to recognise the greatness of his poetry.
The Nobel Prize then as now is huge. For the country, it's such an honour, and it's taken as not just an imprimatur of genius, but that Ireland has been fully accepted now into the great states of the world.
I think the wonderful thing for me was that he gave us the beginning of a literature that was identifiably Irish, but in the English language. I think what Yeats did for me was he gave me a way of being Irish, but in the English language, which was my mother tongue, the language I grew up speaking.
It's also the tongue of modernity, though.
It was the tongue of modernity, but it did not exclude me from Irishness because my Irish wasn't fluent. And the fact of the winning of the Nobel Prize showed that there was a world recognition of this poet and of the literature that he championed. So, you know, we didn't have to feel ashamed of it or feel in any way that it was second-rate or whatever. This had been recognised internationally, and we could embrace it without any feeling at all that we were embracing the colonialists' language. He was a more important ambassador for our state than any statesman who was Taoiseach, or as it would have been called, President of the Executive Council.
So did the new state fail him?
Yes. It was petty, and he wasn't, ever.
Willie's version of Ireland was being smothered. But one of his greatest weapons was outrage. New, stark, sexual poems, sometimes written in a woman's voice, Crazy Jane, always speaking the unspeakable.
A sudden blow. The great wings beating still above the staggering girl, her thighs caressed by the dark webs, her nape caught in his bill, he holds her helpless breast upon his breast. How can those terrified, vague fingers push the feathered glory from her loosening thighs?
What lively lad most pleasured me of all that with me lay? I answer that I gave my soul and loved in misery, but had great pleasure with a lad that I loved bodily.
No ups and downs, my pretty, a mermaid, not a punk. A drunkard is a dead man, an old dead man a drunk.
It's great, isn't it? It's like one of yours. Witheringly and insultingly, the Catholic press branded Willie and his like new ascendancy. They dismissed him as a neo-pagan, agnostic, Freemason pensioner. They couldn't handle his utter belief in the integrity of art and the artistic, independent, revolutionary voice.
The Catholic Church, of course, could never reconcile themselves to it. They were spiteful, they were full of hatred, because he represented everything that they were not. Openness, pluralism, modernity, the individual, the thoughtful, the less than infantile Irish that they insisted we were. The patrimony of the Catholic Church. Father, oh father, come on, what father? You're not my fucking father, you know. So he resisted all that.
Yeats's Abbey Theatre had first outraged the narrow-minded patrons in 1907, shocked at Synge's new realism and his depiction of the language, earthiness and sexual frankness of the Irish in Playboy of the Western world. In 1926, he was at it again, with Sean O'Casey's The Plough and the Stars, a less than reverent take on the holy rising of just 10 years earlier, written by a man who, as a committed socialist and revolutionary, had every right to his opinion.
The Plough and the Stars is important because it totally fitted into where Yeats was at that time. He was the public man who'd stepped up to the plate. He'd been going on and on and on and on and on. Really, now people were fed up of this guy going on about the Ireland that should be.
O'Casey's play dared question the rising and its leaders, and Yeats would defend to the death any artist's right to do precisely that.
This is viewed as a national disgrace. Already these men have been set in stone on plinths. Already the GPO 1916 are shibboleths. You cannot say anything against them. They are utterly totemic and vital to the national sense of self. O'Casey is very hardcore about it. He's saying, what was all that for? That didn't really work. Who are we? What is it we wanted to be? All hell breaks loose again. And they couldn't handle that in the same way that Playboy had held up the mirror. This newer Ireland had a mirror held up to itself, and they couldn't stand it. But this time, he ain't going to debate anything. This time, there's a real rage, because he genuinely, like Synge, thinks, here's the new one, here's the new genius. So he walks out on the stage, and the cartoons will show you that stance here, right here at this point, staring at them. He shouts at them, you've disgraced yourselves again. You've disgraced yourselves again! It's not a headmaster chastising the class, it's the disappointed leader.
I'm not sure Willie had it in him anymore. He was getting old and jaded. Perhaps the grubby and pious Ireland he had found himself in was not the romantic Ireland he'd dreamed of. He retired from his role as senator in 1928, his health failing. He said he wished to live his remaining years as a bee rather than a wasp. He started to reminisce about his class, his caste, where he came from. He had an affinity not just for the west of Ireland, but for the Protestant ascendancy, the big house. He wasn't a natural Democrat and harboured a lifelong suspicion of the mob. He believed in that ancient Homeric view of the aristocracy to lead a country, corresponding to his interest in Nietzsche and the hierarchy of class. He felt great families were wiser than governments.
The light of evening, Lissadell. Great windows open to the south. 2 girls in silk kimonos, both beautiful, one a gazelle. But a raving autumn shears blossom from the summer's wreath. The older is condemned to death, pardoned, drags out lonely years conspiring among the ignorant. At some point, these people from whence he comes, the ascendancy, the Protestant caste, his mind goes back thinking about them. He largely sees his speeches as a defence of these people who are being even more marginalised in the new independent Ireland. And he thinks of those evenings in Sligo when he was a young man. And he specifically begins to think of one house, Lissadell. Here we are. Dear shadows, now you know it all. All the folly of a fight with a common wrong or right. The innocent and the beautiful have no enemy but time. Arise and bid me strike a match and strike another till time catch. Should the conflagration climb, run till all the sages know we the great gazebo built. They convicted us of guilt. Bid me strike a match and blow. Part of his insistence that we, the great gazebo built, the great gazebo of Ireland, it's your thing, it's our thing. We cannot be dismissed. We are no petty people. Of course he was right.
He predicted an unspecific and terrifying dark era in Europe, and his fear of communism led him to a misguided dabble in fascism. He wrote silly marching songs for Ireland's blue shirts until he realised they were nothing more than a cabal of the conservative Catholics he so despised. He felt impotent about how the world was going, about where Ireland was going, about where old age was taking him.
I ranted to the knave and fool, but outgrew that school. Would transform the part, fit audience found, but cannot rule my fanatic heart. I sought my betters, though in each fine manners liberal speech turn hatred into sport. Nothing said or done can reach my fanatic heart. Out of Ireland have we come, great hatred, little room, maimed us at the start. I carry from my mother's womb a fanatic heart. That's another great line.
Yeah.
We turn hatred into sport.
You think it horrible that lust and rage should dance attendance upon my old age? They were not such a plague when I was young. What else have I to spur me into song?
Yeats had a family, a patient and loving wife, but also a permanent gaggle of rackety female admirers. Sex, like all acts of creativity, happens first and most in the mind. And sexual frisson had always been the source of his writing energies, yet his impotence left him creatively barren. But then in London, he heard about an unlikely medical procedure.
What is a Steinac operation?
Oh, well, there were a whole lot of things going on at this time, early 20th century, now that they've discovered the idea of glands and hormones and the idea of sexual glands and hormones to, restore people's sexual potency. And the Steinac operation was one of the less out there things because it didn't actually involve transplanting monkey glands. It was actually a one-sided vasectomy. And the idea was that by cutting off the seminal cells and causing them to atrophy, the other cells in the testes would proliferate and recirculate in the bloodstream and restore youth and vitality to the man who had it done. And this wasn't just about sexual potency, it was also about productivity, ability to, in the case of Yeats, to write poetry, but in all sorts of other ways to restore men to full, productive and creative vigour.
Did it work?
No. Well, it was said to work, but I think the placebo effect is a very strong thing.
How can I, that girl standing there, my attention fix on Roman or on Russian or on Spanish politics, Yet here's a travel man that knows what he talks about, and there's a politician that has both read and thought, and maybe what they say is true of war and war's alarms. But oh, that I were young again and held her in my arms.
Part of the keynote of Yeats's last decade, the 1930s, is frustration. Frustration on all sorts of levels. There is, in a celebrated way, his sexual frustration, his declining potency, which he attempts to reverse with this operation, his obsessive pursuit of usually pretty willing women to reignite some sort of sexual excitement in his life, with Edith Heald, with Ethel Mannon, even with Dorothy Wellesley, though she's lesbian, with Margot Ruddock. And all this, I think, links very much to a sense of mortality. He's been seriously ill in the late 20s, nearly died in the late 20s. The wonderful Byzantium poems come out of his recovery from a near-death experience. And I think when you read them in that light, they make an especial sense.
There is no country for old men. The young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. The salmon falls, the mackerel, crowded seas. Fish, flesh or fowl, commend all summer long whatever is begotten, born and dies. Caught in that sensual music, all neglects, monuments of unaging intellect.
As Yeats's age increased and all the vicissitudes that attend old age dropped down on him, he was very aware that life was becoming limiting. And he wrote to his great friend Olivia Shakespeare, he said, "My age increases my change, my need for freedom grows." And for Yeats in the later years, freedom for him was represented by the Mediterranean, the encouraging presence of palm trees, he called it.
An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress.
Like in Ireland, the developers have been allowed to ruin the Riviera, though it's not bad. Better than rowing through Ballaleigh in a flooded January afternoon. He needed to come to the south of France, to winter here. He'd spend summers in England with his various lady friends, but also back at home in Rathfarnham in Dublin with his wife and the kids, though that was increasingly becoming a sort of nurse and patient relationship. Again, the more you read, the more your admiration for his wife increases, and the more he becomes a sort of a contrary old fellow, really.
A drinking song. Wine comes in at the mouth and love comes in at the eye. That's all we shall know for truth before we grow old and die. I lift the glass to my mouth, I look at you and I sigh. That's it?
That's it.
Okay.
Not bad.
I like those short ones.
I think he was willful, self-important, self-obsessed and involved to the nth. And maybe when you read about other great geniuses, or maybe that's what's required. But sadly, with his children, with his wife, with his many, many muses, was he capable of love? And that's the great irony. The man who wrote some of the greatest love poems ever imagined in the English language possibly actually never understood what it was.
A most astonishing thing. 70 years have I lived. Hurrah for the flowers of spring, for spring is here again. 70 years have I lived. no ragged beggar man. 70 years have I lived, 70 years man and boy, and never have I danced for joy.
Yeah, poor fucker. Willie's father had once brilliantly said that their family tended to die slowly, like great empires. W.B. Yeats died peacefully on the 28th of January 1939, surrounded by his wife and his female friends.
He understood he was going. Almost the very, very last act was to change one of the great final poems constructed in the last couple of weeks from the title His Convictions to Under Ben Bulben. Knowing what he was doing at the last moment under Ben Bulben, he's writing himself into finally the pantheon of great Irish heroes, beyond the literary genius, the world genius, no, under the pantheon of great Irish heroes.
Before he died, he instructed George to bury him for a year here in Rockbroon until the fuss died down back in Ireland, and then take him home to Sligo.
They took a plot of land up here for a brief period of time, but war broke out, so they couldn't bring him back to Sligo after a year. Instead, they dug up bones when the lease had run out on the ground and put them down in that building there where the terracotta tiles are. After the war, Ireland wanted their great national poet home. So the French returned some bones that some people say aren't Yeats. There's another fellow called Alfred Hollis who had been buried beside him, or some other geezer. I mean, I love the joke, I love the absurdity as the Irish do, but it is utterly meaningless. The pilgrimages to Drumcliff, that small little graveyard under Ben Bulben, continue from all over the world. Why? Not because of what bones are there, but because of this great genius.
Cast your mind on other days, that we in coming days may be still the indomitable Irishry. Under bare Ben Bulben's head in Drumcliff churchyard Yeats is laid. An ancestor was rector there. Long years ago, a church stands near. By the road, an ancient cross. No marble, no conventional phrase, on limestone quarried near the spot. By his command, these words are cut. Cast a cold eye on life, on death. Horseman pass by.
In the end, Roy, how important is Yeats to Ireland?
I think Yeats is of central importance to the Irish sense of identity, partly because he so brilliantly and aggressively flouted it in his own lifetime. And you get the sense there that Yeats, to the very end, was, as I think Stephen Gwynn said, tearing down idols in the marketplace. And I think that's a great thing to do. Been far too many idols in the Irish marketplace. Yeats devoted his life to tearing them down or to questioning them. And I think one of the very interesting things is how he's impossible to get away from. No matter where you look at Irish identity and Irish cultural history from, he keeps coming up. As George Moore said, everything begins in Yeats and everything ends in Yeats.
Ireland, like everywhere, acknowledges its heroes, often the wrong ones, its loudmouths and its literary geniuses. But W.B., he's at the top of the heap. He's in our DNA. His childhood playground in Sligo is now officially Yeats country for thousands of tourists every year. Under Ben Bulben, I even found an illustrator who created an entire book just about his appalling love life.
This is a fantastic piece.
That was one of the first ones I did.
Yeats proposes to Maud the first time. You can see old womanhood behind the window jeering.
I know, it's all terribly symbolic. Oh,
Maud Gone has said yes. But you know what, it's true, he wouldn't have written a note.
W.H. Auden said of Yeats, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." But he was our mad old Egypt, a permanent adolescent, and above all, an obsessive about love, life, about Ireland. Auden also said he was silly, like us. But Yeats wasn't silly when he said, "My weapon is my verse," and it takes 50 years for a poet's weapons to influence the issue. 50 years after WB died, we elected a woman as president, a human rights lawyer. The power and fear of the Catholic Church collapsed. We finally started to see an Ireland based on peace, pluralism and respect. Now that's Yeats' country.
He is a great historical figure. He's a great radical. He's a great revolutionary. He's a great nationalist. He's a great patriot. Did he succeed from that objective here in Sligo as a kid? Did he win in the end what he set out to do? Absolutely. Did he transform the country? Absolutely. Did he transform literature? Absolutely. And at the end of his life, he sort of said, "What's it all about?" And he looked back, and in another literally deathless poem, he asked the question, "What then?" His chosen comrades thought at school he must grow a famous man. He thought the same and lived by rule, all his 20s crammed with toil. What then? Sang Plato's ghost, what then? Everything he wrote was read. After certain years, he won sufficient money for his need, friends that have been friends indeed. What then? Sang Plato's ghost, what then? All his happier dreams came true. A small old house, wife, daughter, son, grounds where plum and cabbage grew, poets and wits about him drew. What then? Sang Plato's ghost, what then? The work is done. Grown old, he thought, according to my boyish plan. Let the fools rage, I swerved in naught, something to perfection brought. But louder sang that ghost. What then? Well, the answer is Ireland.
And if you missed the first part of Fanatic Heart, you can find it on RTE Player. Next week here on RTE1, as Ryan's 10th birthday approaches, Tommy finds a way of keeping an eye on him from behind bars when the new series of Happy Valley begins. That's next Thursday at 10:15 here on RTE1. Stay with us now, though, for The Good Wife up next.